The splintered wood of the doorframe barely grazed her shoulder before the eviction notice was nailed over the threshold. The paper was stark white against the weathered grey pine her father had hewn himself, the ink a black wound. Heat shimmered off the dust of Redemption's only street, but a chill had settled deep in Clara's bones. She was 18. She was an orphan. She was homeless. Sheriff Brody didn't look at her as he hammered the final nail, his face ruddy and sweating under the brim of his hat. He was a thick man, made of beef and simple loyalties. His loyalty, she now knew, belonged entirely to the man who had bought it. "The church has been very generous, Clara," he said, his voice a low grumble meant to sound like sympathy. "Reverend Thorne is taking on your father's debts as a Christian charity. This is just legal formality." He gestured to the small, pathetic bundle of her belongings on the porch steps, a canvas pack, a bedroll, and a heavy leather satchel of her father's stonemason tools. Everything else, the sturdy furniture, her mother's china, 20 years of a life built by hand, was now the property of the Redemption Church Benevolent Fund. Beside her, a low growl rumbled in the chest of the great black and tan dog at her side. Kaiser's ears were flat, his eyes fixed on the sheriff's hand where it rested near his pistol. "Call him off," Brody warned, not taking his eyes off the dog. Clara placed a hand on Kaiser's neck, the coarse fur a familiar comfort. Her voice was a dry rasp. The town watched. They stood in the doorways of the general store and the saloon, faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew this was wrong. But Reverend Thorne's shadow was long, and the church owned nearly everything in the valley, from the water rights to the mortgage on the smithy. To stand with her was to stand against him, and no one was that brave. She shouldered her pack, the weight settling uncomfortably. She looped the tool satchel over her other shoulder. It was brutally heavy, the chisels and hammers clinking softly, a ghost of her father's work. She wouldn't leave them. They were all she had left of him. "Where are you headed?" Brody asked, a flicker of something, maybe guilt, in his eyes. She looked past him, toward the jagged line of the sun-scorched mesas to the east. "Away from here," he grunted. "It's a hard country for a girl alone." "I'm not alone," she said, her fingers tightening in Kaiser's fur. She started walking, not looking back at the house, at the white paper that had erased her. Each step was a deliberate act of will. The dust puffed up around her worn boots. The sun beat down. The whispers of the townspeople faded behind her until the only sounds were her own ragged breaths, the panting of the dog, and the rhythmic clink of steel tools keeping time with her departure. She was walking toward nothing, a ghost cast out from the only home she had ever known. She walked for 2 days. The sun was a relentless hammer, the air a furnace. The water in her canteen grew warm and tasted of tin, and she rationed it with a miser's discipline, a mouthful for her, a mouthful poured into her cupped hand for Kaiser. Her father's words were a litany in her mind. 100 paces is 60 yards. A running creek in summer means a deep spring. The north face of a rock holds the damp. He had taught her the land not with maps, but with rhythms, with senses. Now, his lessons were the only thing keeping her alive. On the evening of the second day, she found the landmark he described only once, years ago, on a hunting trip. A trio of monolithic stones that looked like a giant's broken teeth, stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. From the giant's teeth, he'd said, follow the dry wash south. 2,000 paces. Watch for a lightning-struck pine. Her legs ached, her skin was burned raw, and a dizzying exhaustion threatened to pull her under. But she counted. 1, 2, 3. Kaiser trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, then glanced back, whining softly as if to hurry her along. The world had shrunk to the next step, the next pace, the next breath. 1,998. 1,999. 2,000. She looked up. There it was. A skeletal pine, its trunk blackened and split down the middle, a jagged scar against the deepening dark. It stood sentinel on a small rise, almost invisible against a rock face. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in her chest. It was real. He hadn't just been telling a story. She scrambled up the rise, loose scree sliding under her boots. Behind the dead pine, tucked into a recess in the cliff wall, was a cabin. It was little more than a box, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud, the roof a simple planked slope. It was so perfectly camouflaged that you would walk right past it if you weren't looking. The door was a simple planked construction with a leather pull. It groaned open into a single, dark room that smelled of cold stone and pine resin. It was small, no bigger than the pantry back home, but it was shelter. A wave of relief so profound it felt like grief washed over her, and her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, the heavy tool bag thudding beside her. Kaiser nudged her face with his wet nose, then began a thorough inspection of their new home, his claws clicking on the packed earth floor. There was a stone fireplace in one corner, a small stack of firewood beside it. A built-in bunk with a straw-stuffed mattress. A crate that served as a table. It was a hermit's hovel, a forgotten outpost. But it was safe. It was hers. That night, she built a small, smokeless fire, the way her father had taught her. Its light pushed back the immense, predatory darkness of the wilderness. She shared the last of her dried beef with Kaiser and watched the flames dance on the stone hearth, her father's masterpiece. He had built this place. Every log, every stone, was a piece of him. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a message. A final gift. And as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, a question began to form in the back of her mind. Why build a place like this? Why hide it so well? It wasn't for hunting. It was for hiding. The next morning, clarity came with the pale light. The cabin was more than a hideout, it was a cache. In a small cellar dug beneath the floorboards, hidden under the bunk, she found supplies that made her weep with gratitude. Sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, salt, sugar. Jars of preserved peaches, her mother's recipe. There were blankets, candles, a spare axe head, even a small, well-oiled rifle with a box of cartridges. Her father had been planning this. For how long? He had been preparing a place for her to run to. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. He must have known he was in danger. He must have known that Reverend Thorne was not a man to be trusted. Anger began to smolder beneath her grief. He hadn't died of a sudden fever, as the town doctor had claimed. The pieces didn't fit. Her father had been strong, a man who could hoist a lintel stone by himself. Men like that didn't just wither away in a week. As she organized the supplies, her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard near the hearth. It was cut differently from the others, the seams too perfect. A prickle of instinct ran up her arm. She took a chisel from her father's satchel, the cool, familiar weight of the tool a comfort in her hand. She worked the tip into the seam and pried. The board groaned and lifted. Beneath it, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a small, heavy box made of cast iron, secured with a sturdy lock. There was no key. For a moment, she just stared at it. It was a solid, uncompromising object, a container for secrets. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the reason for the cabin, for the supplies, for the secrecy. She selected a cold chisel and her father's heaviest hammer. The first blow rang out in the quiet cabin, a sharp crack of metal on metal. The sound of a lock being broken. The sound of a daughter refusing to let her father's story die with him. She worked methodically, striking the lock housing again and again, the vibrations jarring her arms. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The iron was stubborn, but her father had taught her about stress points, about finding the weakness in any structure. Finally, with a sharp crack, the hasp broke. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dried wool, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with her father's initials. T.Z. The pages were filled with his precise, architectural script. She lifted it out, her hands trembling. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thick and heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken words. She sat by the cold hearth, Kaiser resting his head on her lap, and opened the book to the first page. The truth was waiting. The journal began with dates and measurements, the dry, factual language of a master craftsman. June 3, 1887. Met with Reverend Thorne regarding the foundation for the new church. Plans are ambitious. He wants a full stone crypt beneath the nave. Unusual for a town this size, but he insists the cost is no object. Generous benefactor, he says. Clara read on, her father's voice echoing in her mind. He wrote of the work, the long hours quarrying the stone, the satisfaction of a perfectly set course. But slowly, over weeks and then months, the tone began to shift. A thread of unease wove itself into the neat columns of figures and dimensions. August 12th. The Reverend is peculiar about the crypt. He dismissed my usual crew. Insists on only myself and him present for the final layout. Says it is sacred work, not for common laborers. When I questioned the need for the secondary chamber off the main crypt, he became agitated. Spoke of a private place for meditation. The dimensions are wrong for meditation. It is long and narrow. The size of 6 coffins. A chill traced its way down Clara's spine. She read faster, the words blurring together. Her father's entries became shorter, more furtive. He wrote of strange deliveries in the dead of night. Crates that were too heavy for prayer books. He wrote of the way the Reverend watched him, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, a thin, predatory gleam that made the hairs on her father's arms stand up. October 29th. I saw Sheriff Brody helping unload a wagon behind the church after midnight. They didn't see me. The crates were long. Wooden. The same length as the niches I was forced to build in the secondary chamber. Thorne told me they were blessed relics from the east. The sheriff of a town does not unload relics in the middle of the night. The journal detailed her father's dawning horror. He began taking his own measurements in secret, cross-referencing them with the town registry. He noted the families who had suddenly moved on, selling their land to the church for a pittance after a run of bad luck, a failed crop, a sick animal, a sudden debt called in by the Reverend. The land acquisitions always preceded the late-night deliveries. The pattern was undeniable. He wasn't building a crypt. He was building a tomb. He was walling up the evidence of the Reverend's greed. The final entry was hurried, the script jagged. November 5th. He knows I suspect. I saw him looking at my tools today, a strange expression on his face. He asked after you, Clara. Asked if you were a strong girl. I am finishing the cabin. If you are reading this, it means I failed. Do not trust anyone. The proof is in the foundation. The lie is in the stone. He will not let me live with what I know. The journal slipped from her fingers. The room tilted. The air was thin, impossible to breathe. Her father hadn't died of a fever. He had been silenced. Murdered. The man who smiled at her every Sunday, who had patted her head and called her a good child, was a monster. And he had taken everything from her. The grief was a physical blow, but something else rose with it, hot and sharp. Rage. A cold, clarifying rage that burned away the fear. The scared, freezing girl was dead. In her place stood a stonemason's daughter with her father's tools at her side and his last words burning in her heart. The world outside the cabin was no longer just a wilderness to be survived, it was a hunting ground. And she was no longer the prey. She spent the next day ranging outward from the cabin, moving with a new purpose. Kaiser stayed at her heel, a silent shadow, sensing the shift in her. He no longer whined for comfort, he watched the tree line, his body coiled with a protective tension that mirrored her own. She was tracking game, but she was also learning the terrain, memorizing the paths, the hiding places, the vantage points. Her father had given her shelter, but he had also given her a fortress. From the ridge above the cabin, she could see for miles, a panoramic view of the valley floor and the single dirt track that led back toward redemption. Late in the afternoon, she saw it, a plume of dust rising in the distance. A rider. She dropped flat behind a granite outcrop, pulling Kaiser down beside her with a hand signal. He went rigid, emitting a growl so low it was more a vibration in the rock than a sound. She watched as the rider grew closer, resolving into the familiar, bulky shape of Sheriff Brody on his big roan gelding. He wasn't riding hard. He was patrolling, his head swiveling from side to side, his eyes scanning the landscape. He wasn't looking for a lost girl. His search pattern was too methodical, too precise. He was sweeping the edge of the vast tracts of land that now belonged to the church, the very same parcels of land her father had marked in his journal. He was a guard dog making his rounds. A cold certainty settled over Clara. They knew her father had built this cabin. They didn't know where it was, but they suspected it existed. And they suspected he might have hidden something inside it. Brody rode to the base of the giant's teeth, the landmark that had guided her, and dismounted. He scanned the area, his gaze sweeping the rock faces. For a terrifying moment, his eye seemed to pass directly over her position. She held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the stock of the rifle. Kaiser remained utterly still, a statue of deadly patience. She could shoot him. The thought was sharp and clear. From this distance, with the rifle her father had left her, she couldn't miss. It would be so easy. One shot, and the man who had hammered the nail in her life would be gone. But the rage that had sustained her was now tempered by a cold, hard logic. Killing Brody would solve nothing. It would only bring more men, a real posse. It would turn a search into a manhunt. Her father had not left her tools of violence, he had left her tools of truth. Justice was not a bullet. It was a foundation, torn down stone by stone. Brody eventually remounted and rode on, disappearing back the way he came. But the threat was no longer distant. It was here. It had a name and a face, and it was actively searching. She had to assume they would find this place eventually. Time was running out. That night, the small cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The silence pressed in. Every snap of a twig outside, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She couldn't stay here forever. Her father's words echoed, "The proof is in the foundation. The lie is in the stone." He hadn't just left her a warning. He had left her a map. The knowledge that Brody was searching galvanized her. She could no longer afford to simply hide. She had to act. Her father's journal was the story, but it wasn't the proof. He wrote of ledgers, of land deeds, of a pattern of acquisitions. If he was as careful as she knew him to be, he wouldn't have left the final, damning evidence in the same place as the journal. He would have separated them. She returned to the cabin with a new, frantic energy, seeing it not as a home but as a puzzle box her father had constructed. She ran her hands over every stone of the hearth he had built, feeling for a loose mortar joint, a hollow echo. She tapped the walls, listening. She entered the cellar, checking every inch of the packed earth. Nothing. Frustration mounted. Where would he hide it? He was a man of stone and wood, a man who thought in terms of structure, of hidden strength. She stared at the fireplace, the heart of the small cabin. It was a perfect piece of masonry, the stones fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. It was his signature work. And it was too perfect. Her eyes fell on the mantel, a single, thick slab of granite. It was solid, heavy. But the back wall of the firebox. She took a candle and peered inside. The soot was thick, but behind it, the stone seemed different. The mortar was a slightly different shade. It was newer. With trembling hands, she took a small chisel and a mallet. She scraped away the soot. There it was. A single stone, no bigger than a loaf of bread, with a seam of fresh mortar around it. It was a plug. It took her the better part of an hour, working carefully in the cramped space, to chip away the mortar without making too much noise. Finally, the stone loosened. She pulled it free, revealing a dark, square cavity. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against oilcloth. She pulled it out. The package was heavy and flat. Inside, wrapped carefully to protect them from damp, were two more items. The first was a thin ledger book. She opened it. Her father's neat script filled the pages, but this wasn't a journal. It was a meticulous accounting of every land transaction Reverend Thorne had made through the church in the last 3 years. Beside each entry was a second column detailing the misfortunes that had befallen the previous owner just before the sale. William Abernathy. 160 acres, prime river bottom. Debt called in by church fund for seed loan. Foreclosed. Price, 10 cents on the dollar. 3 weeks prior, Abernathy's prize bull found dead, signs of poison. It went on, a litany of induced ruin. The second item was a bundle of letters, tied with twine. They were letters her father had intercepted or been given in secret. A wife writing to her sister in another territory, describing the Reverend's suffocating kindness that felt more like a threat. A farmer begging a cousin for a loan, terrified that Thorne was trying to starve him out. This was it. The cold, hard proof. The names, the dates, the methods. Her father had built a case, piece by damning piece. He hadn't just been a stonemason. He had been an investigator. A silent, patient accuser, gathering the evidence of a rot that went to the very foundation of their town. This was the legacy he had left her. Not just a cabin, but a weapon. The scared girl who had fled redemption was gone, burned away by the fire of her father's last testament. In her place stood a woman with a singular, unshakable purpose. She was no longer a victim of Reverend Thorne's ambition, she was its consequence. She was the reckoning he had inadvertently created the day he decided her father knew too much. For 2 days, she did not sleep. She committed the ledger to memory, burning the names and dates and crimes into her mind until they were a part of her. She read the letters until the voices of the dispossessed families whispered in her ear. This was bigger than her father. It was for the Abernathys, the Garcias, the Sullivans, all the ghosts whose lives had been plowed under to enrich one man. Her father had left her the truth, but the truth was useless if it remained hidden in a mountain cabin. It had to be wielded. She formulated a plan, not of vengeance, but of exposure. She knew she couldn't walk into town and simply accuse the most powerful man in the valley. Brody would arrest her on some trumped-up charge, and the evidence would disappear forever. Thorne would paint her as a hysterical, grieving girl, and the town, cowed and fearful, would believe him. She needed leverage. She needed to shatter the illusion of his piety before he could build a wall of lies around her. She carefully separated the original ledger and the letters, wrapping them again in the oilcloth and hiding them deep in the woods, under a cairn of rocks that looked like 1,000 others. Then, with painstaking care, she took a few sheets of paper from her father's supplies and copied a single page from the ledger, the entry for the Abernathy farm, with its chilling note about the poison bull. She also copied one of the most desperate letters. These copies would be her opening salvo. She packed a small satchel with the copies, some food, and her father's heaviest hammer, which she tucked into the belt at the small of her back. The steel was cold against her skin. It wasn't a weapon for violence, but a symbol. Her father built things. She was here to tear something down. As dusk fell on the 3rd day, a storm began to gather over the peaks. The air grew heavy, electric. Wind soughed through the pines, a mournful, rising howl. It was the perfect cover. She looked at Kaiser, who sat watching her, his intelligent eyes filled with an uncanny understanding. "Stay," she commanded, her voice low and firm. "Guard this place," he whined, a note of protest, but lay down, his head on his paws, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. He understood. This was a hunt she had to undertake alone. She slipped out of the cabin and into the gathering gloom, moving not toward the main track, but up, toward the high, rocky ridges that overlooked the valley. The wind tore at her, and the first drops of rain, cold and hard as pellets, began to fall. The storm was breaking, and so was she, breaking out of her fear, breaking out of her exile. She was returning to redemption, not as a frightened orphan, but as a ghost with a grievance. The journey back was a brutal ordeal. She moved across the spine of the mountains, a dark shape against a churning sky, using the flashes of lightning to navigate the treacherous terrain. The rain came in blinding sheets, turning the rock faces slick and the ground into a torrent of mud. The wind screamed, trying to tear her from her footing. But the storm inside her was greater than the one outside. The physical misery focused her, honing her anger to a razor's edge. Every scraped knuckle, every bruised knee, was a reminder of what had been taken from her. By the time she descended into the valley hours later, soaked and shivering, the storm had passed over, leaving a world washed clean and silent under a sky of bruised clouds. Redemption was asleep. The windows were dark squares in the false-fronted buildings. Only a single lamp burned, a lonely beacon in the sheriff's office. This was her destination. She didn't go to the front door. She moved like a wraith through the alleyways she had played in as a child, her boots making no sound on the damp earth. She slipped behind the jailhouse to the small, barred window of Brody's office. He was there, slumped at his desk, a bottle of whiskey beside the lantern. His face, illuminated by the golden light, was slack with drink and exhaustion. He looked like a man haunted by his own compromises. She didn't knock. She waited. She let the silence stretch, letting the night press in on him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stillness like a shard of glass. Sheriff Brody jolted upright, his hand instinctively going for his gun. He lurched to the window, peering into the darkness, his eyes wide. "Who's there?" She stepped out of the deeper shadows of the overhang, letting the lamplight catch her face. He recoiled as if he'd seen an apparition. "Clara? What in God's name?" "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She held up the copied page of the ledger to the bars. "I believe this belongs to you. Or rather, to your employer." He squinted at the paper, his liquor-fogged brain struggling to comprehend the neat columns of her father's script. She saw the moment he recognized the name Abernathy. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My father left a great many things behind," she said. "He was a meticulous man. He built things to last. His records, his work. Everything." He stared at her, the bluster and authority gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He was not a mastermind, he was a blunt instrument, a man who had followed orders and was only now realizing the price. "You need to leave, girl," he stammered. "He'll kill you." Just like he, Brody's mouth snapped shut, but it was too late. He had said it. He had confirmed the unutterable truth. A grim satisfaction settled in Clara's chest. This was the first stone to be loosened. The foundation was already starting to crack. "Just like he killed my father," Clara finished for him, her voice as cold and hard as the iron bars between them. Brody flinched, refusing to meet her eyes. He looked like a trapped animal. The door to the office creaked open, and Reverend Marcus Thorne stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of wet wool and false piety. He had clearly been in the back room, waiting. His face was arranged in an expression of deep, paternal concern, but his eyes were chips of obsidian. "Clara, my dear child," he said, his voice a smooth, comforting balm that made her skin crawl. "Sheriff Brody sent word you were seen near town. We've been so worried. To think of you out in that wilderness alone." He moved to stand beside the sheriff, a united front of corrupt authority. He glanced at the paper in Clara's hand, his smile not faltering in the slightest. "What is this nonsense you're showing the sheriff? The poor man is tired." "You're tired? Let us find you a warm bed at the church." "I'm not tired," Clara said, her gaze locked on his. "And I am not your child." She held his stare, refusing to be intimidated by the force of his personality, the practiced charisma that had fooled an entire town. She saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes before it was masked again by concern. "My father built your church, Reverend. He built it on a foundation of secrets and lies." Thorne chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound. "Grief does strange things to the mind, my dear. Your father was a good man, but he was a simple man. A laborer." "He was a craftsman," she corrected him, her voice sharp. "He understood structure. He knew when something was hollow." She let the word hang in the air between them. The mask finally slipped. A fraction of an inch, but it was there. The smile tightened, the warmth in his eyes turning glacial. "You should have stayed gone," he said, his voice dropping the pretense of kindness, becoming a low, menacing whisper. "The wilderness is a dangerous place. Accidents happen, so do records," she shot back. "Ledgers. Letters. Enough to interest a U.S. Marshal. The originals are already on their way to the territorial capital. These are just copies." It was a lie, a desperate, monumental bluff, but she delivered it with absolute conviction. She saw the seed of doubt take root in their eyes. They had underestimated the stonemason's daughter. They had assumed she was just a scared girl. They didn't realize she had inherited her father's precision, his patience, and his iron will. She slid the heavy mason's hammer from her belt and placed it on the windowsill. The thud of the steel against the wood was loud in the silence. It was not a threat of violence. It was a statement. A promise. "Foundations can be broken," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of absolute truth. "And I know exactly where to strike." The bluff hung in the air, a tangible thing. Thorne and Brody exchanged a look, a fleeting, panicked glance that confirmed everything. They believed her. In that moment of shocked silence, the heavy front door of the sheriff's office swung open. It wasn't a U.S. Marshal. It was William Abernathy's younger brother, Daniel, his face grim. Behind him stood Maria Garcia, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. And behind them, a handful of others, the brothers, cousins, and widows of the names in her father's ledger. Before returning to town, Clara hadn't gone straight for the sheriff. She had made one stop, at the Abernathy farmstead, on the edge of the valley. She had shown Daniel the copied page, the single entry that detailed the ruin of his family. She had shown him the letter. She had not asked for his help, only for him to bear witness. She had planted a seed, trusting it to grow in the fertile ground of long-held suspicion. Now, that seed had borne fruit. "Reverend," Daniel Abernathy said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Garcia and I have some questions for you. About our families. About our land." Thorne's composure shattered. His face, which had been a mask of command, contorted with fury. The charming preacher vanished, replaced by a cornered tyrant. "This is madness," he snarled, turning on the assembled townspeople. "This girl is a liar, driven mad by grief. I have been your spiritual guide, your benefactor." "You have been our predator," Maria Garcia retorted, her voice shaking but strong. "You prayed for us with one hand and signed the foreclosure with the other." Sheriff Brody, seeing the tide turn, began to back away, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "This is between you and the Reverend. I was just following the law." Clara's voice cut through the rising chaos. "The law you helped him break every time you unloaded one of his secret crates in the middle of the night." Brody froze, his face ashen. The townspeople surged forward, their quiet doubts now a rising wave of anger. The institutional power Thorne and Brody had wielded for so long was an illusion, a dam of fear that had just been breached. It wasn't a mob. It was a jury. Clara stepped back from the window, her work done. She had not come for vengeance. She had come for truth. She had brought the evidence to light, and now the town, awakened from its slumber, would deliver its own justice. She turned and walked away from the sheriff's office, the sounds of shouting and accusations fading behind her. She did not look back. She walked through the silent, muddy streets of Redemption, the town she had been cast out of. The air felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of the Reverend's long shadow was beginning to lift. As she reached the edge of town, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the eastern mesas, painting the sky in hues of soft gold and rose. The storm had passed. A new day was beginning. She had a long walk back to the cabin, back to Kaiser, back to the life that was now truly hers. She was 18. She was an orphan. But she was not homeless. Her home was the truth her father had built, and it was a foundation that would never be broken.